Welcome everyone to another podcast. We recorded this at a meeting of Greater Glasgow Pensioners for Indie, and they had invited Andy Anderson to speak to them. Now, if you know Andy Anderson at all, you'll probably have heard him talking about economics, but this was different. He was talking about a website and a strategy that he and some others have come up with, and it's called Respect Scotland's Sovereignty. We're going to listen to Andy's talk, and there are some question and answers afterwards. What struck me about it was because there are various people who talk about various ways in which we could achieve independence without, a referendum, without asking Westminster at all. I don't know about you, Fiona, but to be honest, I listen and I think, there's not any shortcuts, and maybe some of these might even work, although I have my doubts with some of them, but there's no point in trying any of it until we're well over and settled at over 50%.
They're all about process.
They're all about process, and actually fair enough. And it may well be that we got over 50%, sustained, and Westminster carries on saying, no. Okay, then maybe we do start to think about alternatives. However that may be, at the moment, there have been a couple of polls that are over 50%, 54. If we were back here in June next year and it was the same thing, I would probably be singing a different tune, so we'd have a laugh at that. Anyway, Andy and his colleagues have come up with a different way of doing it, and he put it quite succinctly. He just said, the Supreme Court was set up in the UK. That's been a bit of a bulwark for the Union, so let's just step round it and do it differently. The way they're suggesting that this might be done is to use one of the UN, I think it's a convention, I've forgotten the name of it.
It's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
Yeah. Andy's going to tell us about it, and then there are some questions afterwards. See what you think.
This event was recorded on the 25th of October in the Bacchus Bar in Glasgow. It was well attended, so there is a little bit of background noise, particularly at the start, but you soon forget about that once Andy gets into his stride.
I'm going to start by referring to another event, which is the Skye Bridge campaign, which I was involved in. And I wanted to do that to illustrate something that's important in relation to how we deal with the British authorities and how they deal with it. The Skye Bridge opened on the 16th of October in 1955, and we were involved right at the start to protest and try and deal with the issue. A few weeks before it opened, we got together, organised a group. Community in Skye is difficult to organise because the big island and people are separated in small communities all over it, and it's not easy to communicate. But we decided we would start it off and we'd have a go. And the first thing we discovered, immediately we got together, I had experience as a trade union official, and I'd run campaigns before and strikes and activities, so I put forward some proposals based on the fact that my assumption was that the Skye Bridge would be under civil law provisions and we could challenge it in the civil courts. And so I put forward proposals. One of our members took that to his lawyer, and he came back and said to us, this won't work because the Skye Bridge system is different. The law affecting it makes it a criminal offence not to pay the toll, and therefore you can't go to the civil court. You're either guilty or not guilty, whether you pay or not, and you're in the criminal law system, which was unique in Britain, as well as the toll system, which was part of the PFI idea, was also unique. So we were dumbfounded. We didn't know as a committee what we can do now. How can we operate? How can we fight it? Because if we challenge it, we won't be forcing the company to go to the civil court. The company will just get the police in, and we're confronted with the police, and we've got a criminal charge. And so, because of that, we had a long fight, 9.5 years. At the beginning, the lawyers told us, even the lawyers who were supporting us, told us we couldn't win. Everybody, the lawyers were certainly united on that. Every one of them told us we couldn't win. And what we discovered, of course, was that in 1992, the summer of 92, while they were still looking at the foundations of the bridge before it was built, the Westminster put through a bill, the New Roads and Streetworks Act, which none of us had any knowledge of or interest in. And Schedule 1 of the New Roads and Streetworks Act was the Skye Bridge and tolls and making it a criminal offence not to pay the toll. So all of that was prepared 3 years before we first were confronted by it. What that tells me is this: if you're dealing with the British government, they plan well ahead and they organise what they're going to do well ahead, and they knew that we didn't know at that stage that the new bridge was going to be a toll bridge, that we were going to have to pay the highest tolls in Europe. We didn't know any of that. They knew it, and they made the plans preparing for our opposition. So they had the plans in for our opposition before we even knew we were opposing it. Right? That tells you something. It tells you something about how the British government operate. I say that because if you look at the independence campaign, there are clear indications that they did forward planning to lead us into certain traps, put certain obstacles in our way. Some of them I'll identify tonight, but I don't know them all. There are other traps. You know, that's how they operate. They operate in advance, working out what's going to happen and ready to deal with the opposition. One of the traps they set up is, you'll remember that the Bank of England, Gordon Brown decided to make it independent of the government. This is nonsense, of course, because it's not in the government controls the Bank of England. But they set it up on the basis that it was going to be an independent bank, and that they were going to broaden the board and bring in people from Scotland even. Even the bloody Scots were going to get a seat on this board. It was going out of London, you know. It was going to be wider. That's what they said. That's what they did some work on. The other thing they did was they set up a system which, in any economic system, is valuable to have. They were going to set up this system of data collection for Scotland. It's called GERS. They set that up. In theory, something desperately needed. Collect the data. Any economy needs to have good data collection, because you can't make good economic decisions if you don't have the data. So setting up the data was, on the face of it, same as with the Bank of England's changes, on the face of it, a very sensible, wise thing to do and helpful to Scotland's development. We now know, of course, that the data they were collecting was absolute nonsense. It's a political propaganda machine, and it's got nothing to do with collecting accurate data. Most of the data within GERS today is estimates. They're not accurate. It's not useful for data collection, but it's useful for propaganda, and that's what it was for, and that's what it's still for, and the Scottish government's still paying for it. So that was another thing that they laid, and they laid that well in advance. But they did something else. They set up a Supreme Court, the United Kingdom Supreme Court. Now, we were 300 years in the Union, and we didn't have a Supreme Court. But here we had a Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. And that's interesting, because the United Kingdom doesn't have any other courts, and it doesn't have any laws. There's no British laws. There's no UK laws. There's English law, which is the bulk of the law in England and Wales and Northern Ireland, and there's Scottish law. But there's no British law. There's no UK law. So how can you have a UK Supreme Court if you don't have any other UK court? That tells you something about what the nature of this court is. And the fact that we didn't need it until a few years ago, and the fact that it suddenly got right at the centre of the independence question is interesting, isn't it? It's interesting. So these people make their arrangements and their plans beforehand, and these are traps that are to bog people down in. And we've got bogged down in a number of those traps. When we started, the SNP started off saying they would share in the pound. After all, the new Bank of England safe, reliable currency. Nonsense. It never was, it never altered, and They used that when it came to the referendum, didn't they? Alex Salmond getting beaten in a debate by, by what's his name? Alistair Darling. He couldn't argue his way out of paper bag. And he beat him in the debate because he kept saying about the question of the currency and what alternative did Salmond have, and he didn't have any. And that exposed them. In terms of shares, that's been widely exposed now by a whole number of economists who have pointed out that it's utter nonsense. So we now know that is utter nonsense, but we're still doing it. That the Scottish Government is still paying for this nonsense propaganda against us. And we now have got evidence that the people who set it up acknowledging. People are not quite so clear about the UK Supreme Court. And this caused a tremendous amount of difficulty in the independence movement, because they made a judgment in November 22 based on an application from the Scottish Government, a rather stupid application asking about the powers of the Scottish Government in relation to a referendum that they were going to hold. And the UK Supreme Court pointed out that, in their view, the Scottish Government is just an adjunct of the Westminster Parliament and can only operate within the terms of the Scotland Act. And even if it's not within the terms, even if there's no challenge directly in terms of the Act, the implication that there might be is good enough for them to say the Scottish Government can't do it. So the Scottish Government is a tame government relating to that. If you look at that historically, they're saying that that the Scottish Government was set up by the Westminster Parliament, who out of the blue, in a political vacuum, decided that they were going to set up a Scottish Parliament. Utter nonsense. The Westminster Parliament fought tooth and nail against the devolved Parliament. They even rejected a referendum with a majority. They turned it down on the basis that it wasn't a satisfactory majority in terms of their conditions. So there was no ambiguity. There was no political neutrality. That was set up against the struggle against the Parliament and the Westminster Parliament, and the Scottish people were widely involved in it. They even drew up the terms that was later set up in the Westminster Parliament. So it's a nonsense to say that this was in the political terms. And this Parliament, in the view of the UK Supreme Court, can be closed down tomorrow if Westminster decides that should be taken. No reference to the Scottish people. Scottish people are not relevant at all in this. Now, you can either get tied up in a bog fighting that, because if you fight it, you'll get loads of lawyers would like you to fight it, because they get loads of money. And we could be collecting money and giving it to the lawyers for a long time over this issue. And you wouldn't be very successful, because they've laid the ground before and they know the field. So you're playing on their field and you're playing there again. But of course, you don't need to do that, because if you're wise, you don't bother challenging the Supreme Court. You go around it, leave it high and dry, and go around it and get somewhere else. Now, in terms of how you go around it, the Scottish people are sovereign. That is a clear historical fact. And it is because of the history of Scotland and the history of view towards the king. And we came from the same feudal background as the English law. We both came from the same feudal background. But Scotland changed in the struggle for independence in Bruce's time. Scotland changed by the Declaration of Arbroath, a letter written to the Pope in which it states quite clearly that if the Scottish people, that Bruce as the king, accepted by them, because at that time there was a big argument as to what rights he had to be the king. But they argued to the Pope, he's our king, but if he doesn't do what we want him to do, we can change him. Right? They wrote that in feudal terms. And more astonishingly, it was accepted by the Pope. And so the Pope was, in a sense, the European organizer of the Christian kingdom at that time. So he played the role that a sort of European court would do today. And he accepted that. So that was accepted that far back that happened. Around about the same time, same period. Actually, around about the time of the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Edward I drew up a proposal, because we hear that the English system came from Runnymede. Runnymede was some time before that. The Runnymede thing only lasted about a year, and it was chucked out. And they had civil war in England over the question of the king's authority. And that continued for a long time. And it wasn't until actually the same year as the Battle of Stirling Bridge that Edward signed into the English law the policy that they have today. The king in Parliament is sovereign. Note, the king in Parliament, not the people. No reference to the people in the English constitution. So there are fundamental differences between these two constitutions. In Scotland, that was tested again, just before the Union, when both in Scotland and in England, the establishment in both these countries, not democratic establishment, of course, but the establishment in both parliaments wanted rid of the Stuarts for very good reasons, because there had problems historically in the past by the divine right of kings and all its problems. And so they wanted rid of James the Seventh of Scotland, second of England. They wanted rid of him. And both parliaments got rid of him, but they got rid of him on different terms. The English Parliament still had this view that the king in Parliament is sovereign. So if the king in Parliament is sovereign, how do you get rid of the king? Well, they said he deserted the throne. He ran away. He left London and he went to France. He deserted the throne. So that's why we had to change it and get his daughter in and her husband, because he deserted the throne. That was the argument. In Scotland, they didn't have that argument. They said he didn't do the job properly. He wasn't doing it right, and he was a danger to us, and so we got rid of him. So the Scottish position is quite clear. And they then passed the Bill of Rights, which was then established before the Treaty of Union and was incorporated into the Treaty of Union. So our saying that the people are sovereign in Scotland is based on fundamental rule of law and in Scottish law, been accepted by the UK Parliament because it's in the Treaty of Union, and been accepted by the UK Supreme Court as well. So it's a fundamental, important political, legal situation. Now, it's got one big problem, this sovereignty of the Scottish people. They've got no bloody way of expressing it. How do you express it? How do you use the sovereignty? If you've got it, use it, but how can you? What's the mechanism for using it? That's the problem. Now, that problem we need to overcome. And fortunately, we can overcome it. Following the Second World War, when the horrors of what had happened in Germany became evident, attempts were made in the United Nations to deal with the question of human rights and people's political and human rights. And it was to be organised in a way across the world on the standard approach. And so we had it. And Britain and Scotland was very much involved in setting that up. Scottish lawyers. Now, that was set up, and after it was set up, they, from time to time, produced documents. Covenants, they call them. So there's a covenant on the right of the child, there's a covenant on civil and political rights. The British government accepted these covenants, signed them, but didn't put them into law. Didn't put them into domestic law. The Scottish government, under the Scotland Act, in Schedule 5 of the Act, deals with the question of reserve powers. And it indicates quite clearly in subsection 2, I believe it is, that if you look at it, it says human rights legislation which has been approved by the British government can be implemented into law in Scotland and other places within the UK with no reference to reserve powers. Reserve powers don't apply in this case. That's what it says. Now, I'm not a lawyer. Lawyers read things and interpret them. Sometimes it's amazing the interpretation that they put on things. But I've read that section. It seems pretty clear to me. But more important than that, and what I think of it, the Scottish Human Rights Commission, which has the responsibility of dealing with the implication of this legislation, they read it exactly the same as we read it. That the Scottish Government has the right to implement it. They go further and say it has a duty to implement it. It should be implemented. That's their position. So our position is very much in line with them. In fact, we've been in contact with them to discuss it. We're very much in line with what they're saying. And what we're saying really is this. We don't need to wait for a period to get an election to vote again to decide whether we want independence or don't want independence. What we can do is say to the Scottish Government, and we've written to the First Minister and told him, get your finger out and get this job done. Put this through. Now, they put through. They say they can't do it. And my MP says they can't do it. He says that the legislation is stopping them. Not true. Not true. But he's been told that by the civil servants, who incidentally are appointed by Westminster. And they've told him that he can't do it. But they can do it. They just need to read the act. And they need to just apply. And they haven't challenged the Scottish Human Rights Commission. They haven't challenged them. They said their reading of the law is wrong. And if they thought it was wrong, they would have done so by now. But they haven't done that. And they haven't answered our letter. But I understand they're talking about it in the background. We put in for a petition. The petition committee says we can't do it because it's a reserve matter. We showed them the law. We pointed it out to them. We showed them the position of the Scottish Human Rights Commission. And they've taken the same line. They're looking at it again. They're looking at it again to see whether we can have a petition. Now, it seems to me that it's absolutely vital that we take them on ground that is secure and clear. Because if we took them on any other ground, somebody will be running to the law here and running to the law there, and we'll get bogged down in all sorts of legal debates. But my MSP, in discussing this with me, because I've been writing to him, insisting that he get off his ass and do his job, because that's what we pay him for, to do a job, get the job done. In response to me, he said incidentally that he accepted the Scottish people are sovereign, which is very interesting, since he's ignoring that. But the important thing there is that he said that in that particular thing, I pointed out to him that the Scottish Government put through the child protection legislation, which comes from the same source. And it's in the same paragraph, in terms of the Scotland Act. So, well, you put that through. So you've obviously got the power to do it. And he said, well, the United Kingdom Supreme Court vetted it before we could put it through. Now, I don't know what that means, but I can tell you this, they couldn't change it. The UK Supreme Court don't have the power to change a UN-worded document. So they couldn't change one word or one comma in that document. So the vetting that they did, I believe, was to say, oh well, you put it into Scottish law, but it's not in English law, so it mustn't apply to people in Wales and England and elsewhere. Fine. We know that. The Scottish law doesn't apply to people in Wales and elsewhere. And I think that was the vetting. I think that was where they interfered. Well, let them interfere again on this one, because it doesn't matter. You know, it doesn't matter. They can't interfere with the wording of the document. And what does that document give us? Among other things, it's a fairly big document. There are several different parts of it. But what it does is it says that we have the right not only to representative democracy, but on an equal footing with representative democracy, we're entitled to direct democracy. That means we can hold referendums. That's what it's about. In Switzerland, they hold on average 4 a year referendum. You can hold a referendum. Now, that means that if there was a problem, let's say the post office scandal, if there was a problem affecting a group in the community, that group could insist on the issue going to a referendum and bring in people's involvement, not doing what happened there, being ignored, raising it with our MPs, being ignored for years and get nowhere. And we give them an opportunity to deal with it. So that's the sort of thing that can be done. Now, my argument simply is that our argument in the RSS is simply this. I'm not interested in waiting a period of time to get the right to have a referendum in an obscure question about will we have independence or not. In fact, I don't think most people know what that means. It's somewhat obscure. What is independence? What does it actually mean? I think if we had the power to make specific referendum on specific points, then that would be much more important. And in my view, that would be independence, whatever it's called. If the Scottish people can decide, and you can organise it at any time, to look at and vote on important political and civil issues, then that is independence. I can't think of a better one. Let me just point to a couple of things we could be doing. We could be asking the Scottish people, should we have a written constitution? And should the government set it up and do it within the 2 years and come back to us to a referendum to put it to the people? That would be one way. A lot of work's been done in Scotland, a lot of preparation's been done. Wouldn't be difficult for the government to talk to them and get it set up. We could be asking the government, instead of the problems of austerity and cutting people's living standards that are being enforced on Westminster, to introduce a land tax policy. It takes the money from the rich and reallocates it to the poor. We could ask them to do that. We could put it to a referendum. That, to me, is where where sovereignty, people's sovereignty is actually applying, where you can use it. Take another question. We voted in Scotland for the Scottish Government to have tax raising powers. Remember? Yes. It was attached to the independence thing. Tony Blair put it in because he thought we wouldn't vote for it. But we did vote for it. We voted for the Scottish Government to have tax raising power. When did we vote for the Westminster Parliament to have tax raising power? Can anybody remember that? We never, ever voted for that. They just assumed that they had that power. We could put a referendum saying that all taxes raised in Scotland go to the Scottish Treasury, and any monies for defence and other services, the UK government asks the Scottish government to allocate and show where they're spending it. And if we're a sovereign people, that's what we should be doing. Right? So it seems to me that if you get control of that, you're on the right track. The other thing that I would say is this, that having the good arguments, having all the right arguments, being sure that your arguments are right. Of course, the other side will produce lawyers that will challenge it. Of course they will. There will be challenges. But if you've got good arguments, a child that want to dig, lads that will not surrender. Now, I want to stand with them chills, because then you're in a strong position. You don't back off. And you don't need to back off because your facts will support you and stand with you. Now, we need that. But we need more than that. We need more than that. Because even if you've got all the facts, and if you're right, and you can win the argument, they'll ignore you. Ignore you, not pay any attention. You need power. And it's not the British government or the UK Supreme Court with their fancy wigs and gowns that are stopping us. It's our elected government that is not pushing this through. It's our elected government. So what we do is we don't worry about the Supreme Court. We don't worry about raising money to challenge the guys with the funny hats and wigs. We concentrate on our elected representatives, and we've got time before the next election. We've got in Scotland. We've got time to put the pressure on them, as we are doing with the First Minister, and saying, this is your job, your responsibility. The Scottish Human Rights Commission are telling you to do it. We're telling you to do it. Get it done. Now, if they know, and if they've got enough pressure in their constituency, and they know that their seats are threatened, then they'll listen. Lord MacLeod Kemp said once that politicians don't make waves, they ride on waves that other people are making. And that's very true. Politicians are not going to find an answer to this problem. But if we find an answer and get the wave moving, they'll jump on board. Because they like to be seen. They get their surfboards out and be on top. Because they like to be seen as riding the wave. So we've got to create that wave. And the way to create it, in my view, is that we need to go back to basics. We need to go ward by ward to the people. And we're organising on a ward basis. Units, no more than 100 in each unit. And we're saying to those units, you're autonomous. You don't send us money to the head of the organisation. It's a federation. You're part of the federation, but you're an autonomous group. You keep your own money. More important, you keep your own decision making. And interestingly enough, when political parties and others take away the money, they take away the decision making with it. Decision making stays at local level, stays within the unit. If you agree a general proclamation which we've drawn up, if you agree these principles, if you operate on a democratic basis, if you believe in equality and equal rights of your membership, then you're welcome to be part of our federation. We'll send you data, we'll do the research, we'll send you data, you send us stuff, you send us questions and information, and tell us how you see the campaign operating. And in that way, you can build an organisation. There's nothing like it in Scotland. It doesn't exist. You know, there are all sorts of organisations who say they're grassroots, but they control the money at the top, and they control the decision making at the top. That's not grassroots. Grassroots is where the decision making and the money and the power is held at the bottom, and it comes up that way. That's the sort of structure that we're attempting to build. We started in North Ayrshire, and we're starting to build it, and we want to build it across the country, and that's what we're doing. That's as much as I've got to say. I'll answer any questions on anything I've said.
Why do you think it is that the Scottish Government don't produce their own chair's figures? Is it because they're not allowed to, or is it because they just don't want to?
Well, so that's an important question, because if we're going to have independence, you would certainly need good data collection system. You need a good data collection system, because otherwise you'd be trying to run the economy out like a submarine without a periscope. You wouldn't be able to see where you're going. You need the data in order to help you to run the economy. You can't do it otherwise. So if you're planning to run your economy, the first thing you would do is to make sure your periscope was working. You know, get a good data system. Commonweal made an excellent report, set up what was needed in terms of the system for Scotland, how much it would cost. It was relatively cheap in terms of other expenditure of the Scottish Government, and that they could do it and should set it up. The SNP conference, in a democratic organisation, voted to do that. But it's never been done. So the leadership ignored what the membership had asked them to do. But I don't know is the answer to why didn't they do it. I haven't a clue. But I think it's either laziness or indifference to the interests not only of their own members, but of the sovereignty of the people.
On that point, I did hear that Derek Mackay, just before he fell from grace, had said he was going to produce an accurate JES report in contravention to that one. And, well, after he went, Kate Forbes was asked if she would be producing it, and she said no.
I've heard Kate Forbes say she doesn't really see what the problem is with JES, because what it proves is how badly Scotland does in the Union, because it's basically a set of accounts for the Union. It's not a set of accounts for Scotland.
That's true, but that doesn't negate the necessity for good data. See, I mean, much of JES is just estimates.
Well, that's the trouble, isn't it? The estimate, that's just estimating, there isn't any good
We don't know
data.
how much tax people are paying in Scotland. There's a whole lot of things we don't know.
Yeah.
You cannot run an economy on ignorance. We need that information.
But ignorance helps some people.
Can I take you back to the Skye Bridge thing? Because you said all the lawyers said you're not going to win this. And you said after your battle, you did win it, right? So how did it come about?
Well, in actual fact, in a sense they were all right, because what they were saying to us is that the law as it stands, we can't see a way around it, we can't see it being overturned. And the fact is, it hasn't been overturned. It's still on the statute books, it's still in Westminster. The thing is, it can't operate because there's no tolls there, right? But it's still on the statute book. It's never been got rid of. Now, so they were right in the sense that we never defeated that act. That act's still there. Was we would win in the court of public opinion. Public opinion was more important than the law. No law can work if a large percentage of the population don't accept it and won't operate. Any law collapses if that happens. In Skye, it's a small island, relatively 8,000 people in Skye and Lochalse. We had huge numbers. We had something like 3,000 that were actually charged with criminal offences. And I had over 200 of them myself. So a large number of the population had even one or two charges. So if you get that, the court system can't operate because we blocked the court system up. If it had been a civil matter, as we thought it was, we would have had to pay for any appeals. But if it was a criminal matter, you can get an appeal free. So we had every appeal that was possible. We appealed. I'll tell you a wee story. When we were going down, we were going anywhere off the island, we would always think up an excuse for why we weren't paying. There was all these excuses the police were taking down, and we were testing them out in the court, in the appeal court, to block the system, to really jam it up. And we went to a meeting down in Edinburgh, the Lord James Douglas Hamilton, as a minister speaking at the meeting. And on the way back, we decided, when we stopped for tea, what's going to be our argument this time? So, Lord James Douglas Hamilton at the meeting said that we were Luddites and lunatics that were challenging the bridge. So I said, oh, wait a minute. If you're lunatics, there's a position in it says that if you're disabled, physically or mentally, you don't have to pay. Let's tell them that we're not paying because we're physically, mentally disabled. And so, of course, we came up, and the sergeant who knew the news very well said to me, well, Andy, what's the reason this time for not paying? I said, I'm not required to pay section 4, subsection 2A. He says, what does that mean? I says, it means I'm mentally disabled. He says, mentally disabled? He said, you? He said, you weren't yesterday when you went there. I said, no, I didn't know I was yesterday. I could have been, but I didn't know. I said, but I now know that it's true, because a minister of the Crown in a parliamentary meeting said that I'm a lunatic, and ministers don't tell lies. So it's like, put that down. So you wrote it down. That was one of the charges I got away with. But it just shows you the sort of ludicrous situation you get, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's quite useful for keeping in mind that we go down the road of civil disobedience at some point. Well, then you had your hand up.
About the UN civil and political covenant bit, so do you know how other countries who've taken that on board and presumably ratified it, do you know how they've used it in their own political parliamentary systems?
Many countries have used it. Britain is actually one of the few. Britain accepted it, but didn't ratify it. And I thought afterwards why Britain didn't ratify it, because that was in 1976 that they accepted it and signed on into it, but never ratified it. And then I looked at the Act again and I thought, the Covenant as they call it, I looked at it again and the one thing struck me. Britain, everything in the UN is set out in democratic terms, different terms, you know, representative democracy, participative democracy, direct democracy. You talk in terms of democracy. You don't talk in terms of monarchy. And the English legal system is the King in Parliament. So if they put that straight into English law, there would be a contradiction to some extent. I think that's one of their problems. There would be a contradiction in the context of their legal system. Wouldn't apply to us.
What about the other countries that have got monarchies that ratify it?
Well, I suppose, you see, it depends what their constitution is.
Yeah.
I mean, if you've got a constitution that says you've got a constitution of monarch and that the authority of the people are the sovereign authority, that's fine. When we had a sovereign and still had that policy.
Is there anything, Andy, we can learn from the fight with the Chagos Islanders recently, when they've got their democracy, well, forget their England, but I know that the Americans are still getting the right to use the airbase, etc. But is there anything we can learn from their fight over many years to get back to the right?
Well, I think one of the things that's obvious, and should be blatantly obvious to all of us now, is that you can have the best courts in the world, the best ideas in the world, and the International Court of Justice has found Israel guilty and told them not to do certain things, and Israel has continued to do it with the backing of the United States. So we're living in a world where the rule of law is being treated with contempt. And what's happening there is much worse than anything that I've seen in my lifetime. I was a soldier at one time, and for these people to call themselves soldiers who are behaving in the way that they're behaving, these are thugs and murderers. And this is a terrible thing that's happening. And it's clearly against the human rights of the people involved. It's clearly against international law. That is well understood, but nothing is being done about it. And that's one of the problems. We're supposed to have a law-based society. We do not. So I think that the best thing we can say is we've got a legal system which is not working because the people's voice, the sovereign voice, is not being heard. Get that sovereign voice where it should be heard and in the say, and improve our legal system, and you help to improve legal systems elsewhere.
You were saying that you had information that could be shared with grassroots groups.
Yeah.
How would we access that?
Well, what we're doing at the moment, we're starting in Norfolk, Ayrshire. And what we're doing is we're sticking a leaflet around the doors in local localities and setting up units locally. Because if you've got people that know each other, they're in a much better position to be, and also we're trying to encourage young people to get involved. Because if they have got control of the unit and are able to do it, they work better. So if you want, we'll obviously be looking at Glasgow and seeing, what can we start it up there and how we can start it. If you contact me, if you're interested, I'll organise that we try to get groups, particularly if you've got other people interested, at least two people, a chairman and a secretary for a unit. We set the units up, and then they operate themselves. They're democratically controlled. They sort out their own constitution and how they're going to function. So our job will be to set it up, but we will help to get it set up. Once you're set up, we've got a website that we'll be tuning into, you'll be able to tune into and get a lot of information. You'll find out what we've written to the First Minister, you'll find out what they're saying, and any questions you've got, send them to us, we'll get answers. So that's how we're going to work. We're going to be working right through the winter. Our intention is to use this winter period to build up the movement, because you'll never get politicians to respond unless you get the people motivated, and that's our job to try and do that.
I'm just thinking, maybe if you say what the website is.
It's Respect Scottish Sovereignty .scot.
That was Andy laying out his thoughts on a possible approach for the Yes campaign. As we said at the beginning, it starts to get a lot more interesting and relevant once we're at 54%, as we are currently, and hopefully moving higher. I have to say, Marlene, I don't know about you, there were some points in Andy's talk there that I thought, I'd like to know more about that, because either I don't understand it or I'm not convinced by it, but that doesn't mean that it's not really good that somebody is looking at these things. So it may be something even that we do a follow-up and come back to Andy with perhaps some questions and dig under some of these points. Maybe that'll be one for 2025. Thoroughly interesting to listen to.
Yeah, thanks very much, Pensioners for Indy, for organising that.
And thanks to everybody for listening. We'll be back again next week with another episode. Catch you later. Bye now.